Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amber Cagwin, and I'm the Director of Disability Services at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I want to welcome you to today's topic, Creating Solutions, How to Handle Complex Accommodation Needs and Conversations, presented by the staff at the UA Disability Services offices from UAA, UAS, and UAF. Our presenters include Ann Lazenby, our Director of Disability Support Services at UAA. I'll be presenting a little bit as well. Devin, Tatro, Disability Services Manager at UAS. Karen Haddock, our Assistant Director at UAA. And Marissa Jesser, our Assistant Director at UAF. We will be going into multiple scenarios to kind of walk through what potential accommodation needs you may be coming across in classroom situations, but these also could potentially apply to outside classrooms. So we'll be talking about that a little bit further as well. Before we get started, so we're going to move into a land acknowledgement video. I want to say thank you to Lorraine McConnell, Shamai K. Thacker, and the Disability Support Services Office at UAA for the following introduction and land acknowledgement video.
All access, all the time. Sharing space together. When we come together online, we often don't feel connected to our land and can mistakenly imagine ourselves as disconnected from physical space. In reality, we join these virtual sessions from offices and homes built on the traditional, unceded lands of Indigenous tribes and peoples across North America. Disability Services would like to express gratitude for access to this beautiful, majestic land and for its caretakers. We also acknowledge that our shared virtual space exists because of physical infrastructure. Zoom servers connect us based on resources and availability. When you join us virtually, you're borrowing resources from other communities that make this sharing possible. If you don't know the Indigenous history of the land you occupy and would like to learn more, please visit native.land.ca. The University of Alaska acknowledges the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. University of Alaska Anchorage.
Dena'ina, Atnadine, Alutiiq, Sugpiaq, Chugachmute, and Eyak peoples.
University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Dina people of the lower Tanana River.
University of Alaska Southeast.
Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples.
Welcome to the session.
Okay, so my name's Marissa Jesser. I'm the Assistant Director of Disability Services at UAF on the Trothieta campus. And as Amber said, our whole presentation today is a set of scenarios targeted for usually an instructor in a classroom setting and again, these are common or could be scenarios that an instructor may face. And so we wanted to kind of go through those and how they could be approached both by faculty and how they would be approached by DS professionals on each campus. And as Amber said, these are classroom settings, but they can be these principles and the approaches can be applied to other contexts like academic advising, admissions, any other location on campus or service that a campus offers. So something to be aware of. If you don't think this applies to you, it probably does. Okay, so to jump right into the first scenario, Sally approaches you, the instructor, after you've given a midterm to tell you that they have a disability. You, the instructor, have not received a letter from Disability Services regarding the accommodations. So what should you do? What we did in preparing for this scenario, for this presentation was to say, okay, if we were professors or instructors or TAs, what questions would we have or how might we feel getting this communication from a student? If we maybe are familiar with DS, we might know the answer. If we're not as familiar with Disability Services, we may need to seek support. And I think this has also been referenced. We have a companion document for you all to reference as we go through. We didn't want to overburden you with super full slides. So you can look in the chat to see a link to a Google Doc that is your companion document. I printed mine out because that's what I prefer to do. I also have it up on this side of my screen. So however that works for you to reference, please go ahead and take a look at that. These are all the notes we've built for this presentation. You can keep them and take them with you. They may be revised, and you can always ask us for updates in the future. But this is a resource for you. We're trying to provide practical guidance and information that you can come back to and share with others. So, okay, so I'm the professor and I'm thinking, how would I feel about getting this information from a student? I might be wondering, well, is this student really registered with Disability Services? I haven't received a letter of accommodation. Or do I need to provide retroactive accommodation to the student because now I'm aware that they have a disability and they maybe were expecting accommodations that weren't provided? What other questions do people have? What might you be feeling if you were confronted with this question? Yes, Abel.
Yeah, this is Abel. So these are difficult situations to be in as an instructor. I've glanced through the comments and I would say, well, I asked the student, do you have an accommodation? If not, please go there as soon as possible to get one. And then the question is really, is there anything as an instructor we need to do retroactively?
If the student is registered with Disability Services, you would want to get a hold of that letter of accommodation from our office. If they're not, like you said, you would refer them to Disability Services. And the big thing here is not to move forward with accommodation without involving Disability Services. So always come back to DS if there's a question or concern. We're always here to help navigate these types of situations. So students can request accommodation and register with a Disability Services office anytime during the semester. So in this scenario, it could be that the student met with Disability Services and is anticipating accommodations, but the letter hasn't gone out yet. It can take a day or two for that to occur. Or sometimes there's something that needs to be ironed out with the student before that letter can be sent. So it could be they had accommodations that you were not notified of, but that's pretty unlikely. Letters of accommodation are generally not retroactive, so they would be considered going into effect once the instructor has received it. So in this case, that's probably the case. So the instructor never got a letter. They were not notified that the student was disabled and received accommodations on exams. I mean, we don't even know what the accommodations are. Maybe they didn't have exam accommodations, right? But typically in this case, if the professor has not been notified, there's no expectation to do something retroactively. If a faculty member misses a notification of accommodation, if they fail to provide accommodations when they have known in advance that was something that was needed, the student may be eligible for retroactive accommodation. That could look like retaking an exam, doing an alternative exam, or having a way to demonstrate the knowledge on the exam in a way that is suitable for them with the appropriate accommodation. That would also apply. So say the instructor of record for the class has changed. So Professor A got the letter of accommodation because that is who was running the class at the point that Disability Services was sending out the faculty notification letters. That instructor is no longer teaching for whatever reason, a new one has been put in place. Disability Services is not notified, so they do not update the new professor about the accommodations, right? So it's no one's fault, but there's logistical things that happen that make it impossible for an instructor to know everything that's going on. And in that case, the student would still be eligible to have accommodations that they thought their instructors had been notified of. So there can be some things that are hard to predict, and our office is going to get involved and try to help the faculty member and the student come to a resolution that is both, meeting the student's accommodation needs without changing or altering the class.
Okay, I see the next slide has popped up. This is Karen at the UAA office, and this scenario addresses Paul. So I will read aloud. Paul has accommodations in your course, so everything's gone well. A faculty notification letter's been delivered. Everything's going great. Paul's been attending classes, everything going on. They do have an accommodation for extra time on assignments, maybe some flexibility, and also exams. Unfortunately, they are not doing well in the class. Oh my goodness, they have accommodations. They've been showing up to class, but they're not doing well. oh my goodness, what are we going to do? I mean, call DSS, and how can I get this student through the class, and how can they be successful? Not necessarily. So, of course, faculty members very involved with trying to make sure all students in their class is, doing well in the class, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. And students with disability or without disability, sometimes it's just not going well for them in that class. So on the companion document that you have access to, it is, your responsibility is as it would be for all students all the time, treating everybody with, respect of what's going on. Certainly if it's one of your strategies in the classroom to follow up or make announcements about add drop deadline, withdrawal deadline, things that you're doing for all students, not singling out a student with disability. That's certainly within your purview of just making announcements such as that. Certainly your grading rubric, if that's all explained in your syllabus, sometimes any student is just figuring out for themselves, wow, not doing well on the exams, not doing well on other portions of what is making up the totality of the grade at the end of the semester. They could be coming to the conclusion themselves. And absolutely, you have the right to fail any student that's not meeting the student learning outcomes. Of course you can. There is no magic ticket that someone that's connected with the disability office at any of the campuses somehow is not held to the same standard. So if someone is not meeting the grading rubric as it's designed and explained on your syllabus, then yes, the final grade that's applied at the end of the semester could possibly be an F, and that is fine as long as everything is not arbitrary and capricious. And the way we've set up this scenario, of course, that's not what has happened. It's just the way it is. And no, you will not get in trouble for failing a student who has accommodations. The accommodations are trying to ensure that there's an equitable playing field, but that also includes the right for the student to fail a course. So there, any unsure qualms that you have, oh my gosh, this is a student with disability, I've got to get them through, is not your burden to take on. You're treating all students in the class with the same method of how you're instructing the class. You can certainly reach out to our DS offices to consult, collaborate, run through a scenario of what's going on. We're good listening ears to figure that out. But many times is nope, sounds like you're doing the right thing. Nope, okay, and you should explain this to all students. Nope, everything seems fine. So as long as you're grading the student as fairly as you're grading all the students on the roster for that class, you are effectively, managing your classroom responsibilities. And I can just reiterate again, it's okay for a student with a disability to fail a course. It's absolutely acceptable for that to happen because the student has not made the given evidence of successfully learning what the objectives are that you've outlaid for the course. And I'm just reading through on the bullet here. Students are responsible for the successful completion of their courses. There's an equal chance for all students, with or without accommodations, to fall behind in courses. Of course, that happens. And both students with and without disabilities experience barriers that inhibit their success. So it's just voicing that, yes, it's okay to fail a student in your course when you've received a faculty notification letter about their accommodations and you have applied the accommodations and everything is fair and equitable. Right. Are there any questions? Again, I don't even have the screens up properly to see anything. I see chat. Let me just make sure. I see that someone a couple moments ago, Leo, was talking about equally, not equitably, unless we have paperwork. Yeah, there's all sorts of semantics with words. I mean, some things can just be, well, that's fair, and that's equal, and that's equitable, and all those. There are nuances to what they are. Something that is completely fair is not necessarily equitable. I mean, if you have a box, a soapbox, to be able to stand up on it and see something over a fence, that was fair, but it might not be equitable to a person that still could not use that accommodation to be able to access what was over the fence line for them to be able to see. So I hope I helped to address that. And I think that might be it. We have so many scenarios. I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity.
Yeah, and Karen, thank you for clarifying that. The original question was just talking about if a professor gets information from a student about a disability directly and they feel that they want to provide accommodation without getting disability services involved, that they should not do that. Disability services should always be ultimately the voice when providing accommodation. It's really in place to protect faculty and students both.
Thank you for that, Marissa. I didn't even see it. I just went right down to whatever would have been, and I said 122 and my clock said 123. So that must have been the question. So thank you for making sure I didn't miss a question for Cass. So thank you.
Okay, I think we can go to scenario 3. Yeah, okay. So Erica is a dual enrolled high school and college student. So at UAF, this might be a North Star student. I don't know what they're called at the other campuses. The student claims that the accommodations they get in your course are the same as what they get in their high school courses. These include written instructions, fewer test questions than the rest of the class, and they're able to use notes on all exams. So the student's coming to you saying they want what they have in high school in your class. And you might be wondering, do you need to provide the accommodations the student's requesting? Can you provide them without getting DS involved? And then also they have a letter from the Disability Services Office at your college that you did receive, but it does not match what the student says their accommodations are that they would like to have in your class. What should you do? So we've hit on this a few times already, but it is incredibly important. So if the student is registered with Disability Services, it's very important that you have their letter of accommodation and follow the letter that you receive only. If they're not registered with Disability Services Office and they only have their high school accommodations, that they probably don't know that they need to get connected with our office. So it's really good to connect that student with Disability Services and say, hey, we have the equivalent of what you get in high school, but there's a college version, and they might have different rules or different standards. So you really need to get that figured out before I can apply the accommodations you're requesting in my class. And you also need to be really firm with the student that you're only going to be able to provide accommodations that are in their letter from the campus that that you work for, right? So it may be that they want these other accommodations, but they're not in that letter, and there is probably a good reason for that. The other thing that you can do is say you have this student in your class, you've got their letter of accommodation from our office, and you don't think that they're working that well. You can kind of see where the student's coming from, right? What they have from Disability Services at your campus isn't maybe meeting the need or isn't really a good fit for the type of course that you're teaching. That would be a good time to get a hold of DS and let them know. Provide your insight. Some students don't know, what they can ask for or what modifications may be best for them. So if something's not working well, it's always a good idea to find out if there's a different modification or different accommodation that could be appropriate for that student in that situation. But the reason we really wanted this scenario in here is because there are major differences between high school accommodation processes, anything in K through 12, and accommodations in higher education. There's a resource going into the chat right now about those differences, just as a general guide for you folks. You're not really responsible to know all of those details, but to know that there's the laws are different, the goals of the laws are different, and the goals of the accommodations are different. So some of the examples that the student is asking for, fewer questions on tests, that would be considered a fundamental alteration that we would not change the standard for any student in any college class. Every student needs to meet the same standard, so same number of questions. How they answer those questions, the amount of time they have to answer those questions may change based on accommodation, but doing less is not meeting that same standard. So that would not be appropriate in the higher ed context. And then each of these other ones, written instructions and notes on exams, that's really dependent on the information that we receive from the student, both from the disability they experience and the barriers that they experience. And so that's not going to be appropriate for every student with disabilities. It may be appropriate for some, but not for all. And that is really something that needs to be worked out with disability services so that faculty aren't guessing, what's appropriate for each person. We're kind of able to have that more intimate conversation and then share that with you all. Let's see. If the student comes back from re-meeting with DS, they've gone through all the steps, they've done what they can, and the accommodation that they want is still not on their letter, you have to hold them to the letter. We will never stop working with a student and trying to find something that works for them. We will always come back to the table and rework things, but we ultimately can't provide accommodations that are not appropriate in the higher ed context. One kind of just broad point about K through 12 and higher ed is that generally speaking, K through 12 accommodations are designed for students to complete the K through 12 education. So it is really oriented towards success. They will make modifications so that the student can complete and graduate. Higher ed is not like that. Accommodations, the only goal is access. Whether or not the student is successful, once they can access all the materials, course content, every single aspect of what you're providing, if they have access to it, their success is ultimately their responsibility, not the responsibility of DS or the instructor. I guess I would also say, this is what we do. So we talk about it all the time. And sometimes we talk about it like, yeah, so everybody knows, and it seems super casual, but it's a lot. And it's okay that you don't have that information internally. That's why we're here.
Yeah, so maybe let's take a pause and see if there are any other questions that folks have right now. Looks like Barbara's coming on with a question, maybe?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, one thing that it seems like maybe has shifted over time, or maybe my understanding has shifted, was students that are currently in high school and they bring in their IEP as, or a 504 plan as documentation. And so because I'm in Kodiak, I typically work really closely with Anne and Karen to help me determine how does that translate to the college environment, and do we need additional documentation and those kinds of things. So I do appreciate my experts in Anchorage.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful comment. Those don't carry over directly. An IEP or 504 plan can be incredibly helpful for us, especially if it provides really good information about the disability the person experiences. And usually what I do when I get one of those to apply to higher ed is I go through all the accommodations the students used to. I pick out what does clearly transfer. And then I pick out what is going to be more on the student's responsibility to access as an available resource. And then I highlight the things that are kind of assumed of all college students. So you've got college readiness, things that anybody can get help with, and then the actual accommodation. So we're saying you can get all of this, but not all of it's going to be provided by this office. And that usually goes a long way with that student. But there's a huge shift for students, their parents, everybody involved in that, coming from K through 12 to higher ed.
And Cass said in the chat that a major and important change is that high school to university students are expected to go from getting helped to asking for help. And we see that a lot where students will show up and say, but I had this in high school, why don't I have it now? It's like, well, you need to come talk to us, because in high school it sort of magically appears and follows them.
Yeah, K through 12, they're mandated to identify students who need support. And here, students have to come to us to identify themselves, or nothing happens. So some students assume that people are providing accommodations for them and nothing is actually in place.
And there's a follow-up that was added just after that. That Cass added, what I didn't say explicitly, but instead implied, is that with that change, it seems like we as instructors should make that clear, since that change seems to be universal with going from high school to university. We're here to help when you ask. And yes, you should be making that very clear to students that you're here to help when you asked, and you'll direct students to disability services if you're asked about it, or if the student lets you know that they have a disability. But any student with a disability who wants accommodations should be contacting disability services to get those accommodations, not requesting them directly from you as the first step, because you're not going to be able to do much other than refer them to our offices. So yes, saying that explicitly in class and not just including it in your syllabus is something that you can do to help those students in your classrooms. We encourage our instructors to do that. That would be a huge help for your students, especially those who process things verbally more so than those who, they need it just in written form. So having both of those forms would be very helpful. Latrice had also raised your hand at one point. I don't know if you still have a question.
I will save them for later.
Okay, thanks, Latrice. All right. Any other questions? We'll move on to the next scenario. All right, so our next scenario is about Joe. So in Joe's situation, as the instructor, your course assignments include a group assignment. There will also be a class presentation. Joe approaches you to tell you that they have a disability and has an accommodation to work alone without doing the presentation. So going back to the companion document, you're going to have some questions in this scenario, possibly things like, is exemption from group work accommodation? Is that even possible? Can the student be expected to do an entire group project on their own? Is group collaboration an essential part of this assignment? How can the student participate? Can the student pass the class if they can't work with other students? I mean, what if the entire class is about presenting? What if it's a group speech class, right? Group communication. So there's lots of potential resolutions with this situation. Depends on the type of class, but there's things that you as an instructor can do, especially in advance in this situation, to kind of think through what happens if you get a student with this type of accommodation. Some advanced planning can help. But you want to consider your course syllabus, the course learning goals, the student learning outcomes, and the specific unit or the chapter's learning goals. And then, do some, think about collaboratively determining if the group work is a final part of the course. What is it that your goals are for the course and the students' learning objectives? What are you trying to help them achieve? You can include a syllabus statement that group work cannot be replicated based on the nature of the course. If that's appropriate, it's something to consider. It could be that your collaborative assignments are just a tool that you're using to manage the amount of grading or providing an experience that the students would feel is a helpful experience, but it may not be essential to how your course is designed or the things that you're trying to help them learn in the course. So that could be a different story as to how you'll want to manage that. And again, disability services can navigate through that with you and how that applies to the student. So we encourage you to reach out and talk with us about the particulars of the situation. But definitely keep in mind, don't panic. We can help you through it. It is a very rare accommodation for a student to have a situation like this. And it's certainly not appropriate for all courses or coursework, the assignments in the courses. You definitely want to think about whether or not did you actually get a faculty notification letter or a letter of accommodation from the Disability Services Office. You don't want to accept the letters from the students directly. You should be receiving them from our offices. If you did get a letter, does it outline those things directly? If you did not get a letter, you want to make sure that you refer the student to Disability Services. If you did get a letter and they have the accommodations, is the presentation an essential element of the class, or is it intended as a way for you to assess their knowledge? Is there a different way to assess their knowledge of the material? And there's some alternative ideas listed as to how you might be able to do that. Some things could be that maybe they present directly to the instructor rather than in a group situation. Maybe it's a small group, of 3 or 4 people and the instructor. Could be that the student could record themselves presenting and then provide that recording to the instructor. Or it could be a video or audio recording in advance and present it to the class so that they don't have to be up in front of the course or in front of the class, excuse me. The instructor could oversee group interactions. Maybe that's part of the struggle that the student is experiencing. One of the barriers that they may have. So helping them identify when appropriate work times would be, where they would meet, who's responsible for what portions of the project. For individual presentations, helping by giving the student an option to present with a partner or in a group situation instead of alone. Maybe the student is given the choice of when to present, such as which date or which part of the class, whether it's at the beginning, middle, or end of the class. Maybe the student doesn't receive a grading deduction if they read from their notes while presenting. Maybe the student needs to sit rather than stand during the presentation. Possibly creating a slideshow with video or audio embedded within each slide with their comments rather than stand up and do a presentation. It could be that they submit a written paper on the subject matter instead of doing a verbal presentation. It could also be a portfolio of evidence demonstrating their mastery of the skill or subject matter. So there may be alternate ways for them to present their information about and their knowledge of the material. So there's a question in the chat. In what instance would this accommodation be given? So I think there's probably several instances. It could be somebody who's nonverbal. It could be a situation where, somebody has severe panic attacks, in terms of being up in front of a group of people, where it would be debilitating for them to be in that situation. But because maybe that class doesn't have that information in the basic information about the course material and how that course is listed, it's a surprise that requirement is part of the course, and so working with the instructor to come up with a different objective or different assignment to meet that objective would be an option. If the course is truly centered around a speech, kind of like I was saying, group communications course, but it's required for them to graduate. It's a required course for them to take. Then maybe we would look at some alternative courses for them to replace with or to petition for them to take. But we do look at, to see what other options might be, but those are some examples of when we would put those types of accommodations into place. Any other suggestions from the group as to when we would provide those accommodations?
I think you covered a lot of good examples of students who may have an accommodation like this. I would say like the goal of our office would be to find a way for the student to complete the course that works right for them, either with one of these alternative ideas or something else that's creative. I have had students with this accommodation, well, the presenting The presenting and no group work, both at the same time, may not present in the same case, the same letter. So, you know, more accommodations can sometimes complicate one that you would easily be able to apply or modify otherwise. But truly, it is going to come down to working with disability services who does have the knowledge of the student so that the student doesn't need to advocate for themselves alone. And then to really allow disability services to work with you and your course format and your objectives to find what will work. That could look like the syllabi, grading rubrics, things like that.
All right. Any other questions? Karen?
Just a comment when a scenario like this has come up before, just depending on how the group has been figured out. If on the first day of class, the faculty's counting out 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the ones go to one side of the room and the twos, because that's just how it naturally to be, make it happen. But sometimes, the role, as long as the student is still doing what they need to be doing, which might be outside of the classroom, deciding on how their presentation is going to be, and someone is taking the notes, and who might be a primary speaker when all 4 of the students are standing before the class to give the presentation. And sometimes even with the student with the disability that is just panic beyond the pale of just, no, I can't do this. How was this not recognized? How did I not see this in the syllabus? Add drop has already ended. What am I going to do? Sometimes it is just a matter of being with the group and having the practice of doing it, and the person might be less verbal as the 4 of them are standing up. Someone might be taking on the lead of the presentation, but if it's a group grade, making sure that the student with the disability still had the participation with their group partners to make sure it's a fair ability of what's going on. That way you're not hearing from the other students after the grade's been assigned that so-and-so didn't do anything, or this isn't fair, or how come I did everything and we got a group grade of a B, but this student did nothing, or the students dragged our grade down. So that sometimes also happens before the magic presentation days even starting, and faculty have reached out for assistance with that, or making sure everything is well. If in fact the student still participates in the group project of how it was designed in the syllabus and it's going through, it can be still a successful experience for the student. So I just wanted to add that part.
Thanks, Karen. All right, we're going to go to the next slide.
Okay, scenario 5 for Tom. So Tom is signed up for a class that includes a field trip, but Tom has a disability and cannot participate with the planned activity. So what do you do? This would apply to anything that happens in your class that a student cannot do physically. So we're talking about mobility from between your fingers all the way up to, could not, walk on their own or lift or whatever, right? So fine, all the way to gross motor, could be any activity in any class. But in this case, it's something outside of campus that the student's not going to be able to access. So the faculty is aware of this. Maybe they're notified really close to when the activity is scheduled to take place. They're not sure what to do. They may be wondering, well, this class has many options for field activity or field trips. And if the student can't participate in any of them, how can they complete the class? Or this class is based on real world experience for a specific job. How is a student going to be able to do the job if they can't do this activity in the class? Does the faculty member have the option to waive the assignment and only grade the student in other areas? Does the whole class have to miss it to make it fair to the student who can't go or do it, whatever the thing is? And then what can be done to help the student access the activity in a different way? How does the instructor make that decision? This is another, this might be appropriate for all of these situations, but don't panic when this happens. There's a way. There's always going to be a way. There's always going to be something that can be done. But the sooner that you can get disability services and the student together to come up with the solution, the better. So right away, contact Disability Services for guidance. This could be because you've spoken with the student, you receive a letter of accommodation, or there's some other general awareness that there's going to be a mismatch between motor ability of the student and some class activity. And I guess I would also say this is a really good time to just feel as flexible and creative as you can, because you never know what can work. So when you reach out to Disability Services to talk about what's going to work for the student in your class and the field trip, it's really important to be really upfront about the student learning outcomes of the activity. So what are the fundamental pieces? What is the point of the activity? What are all students expected to gain as far as knowledge or skill from the activity? Those are going to be really, really important to lean into. Disability Services is going to wonder, what auxiliary aids, tools, or supports, maybe it's a different vehicle, maybe it's an ATV, maybe it's a human being, an aide who attends to assist with certain tasks or to assist the student physically. Maybe it's their lab partner, right? What degree of support for the activity may make the difference without excluding the person? And then alternative ways to access it. So is there a way to make the way it's normally done safe for that person or accessible for them? Or is there a different way to approach it? Usually there is. And again, it usually just requires some prior thought and the participation of the student to say, yeah, that's something that I can totally do. What ends up happening may make you very uncomfortable, but it can still be okay. So I think that's the other thing is if a student is saying, yep, that's something that I'm willing to do and try, I'm going to scoot on my butt the whole 100 feet to the thing, you let them do that. That's going to work for them. That's okay. And you have us to support you and say, yep, that's okay. Let's see. So I have so many examples of different scenarios in my mind, but they tend to be real world ones. So I'm trying not to lean into something. But this is one that can seem really scary, but it is totally approachable. A good way to help students prepare for your class in advance or the field of study that you're in or the line of work that your class is related to is to work with your department to make sure that they have really clearly outlined their requirements for each program and for each class. So if it is absolutely essential that a person be able to lift 25 pounds above their head for 10 seconds or more, and there's no way to get around that, that should be very clear to anybody who's signing up for that class in advance. So they can either seek accommodation in advance or say, oh, that's not something that I think is going to be a good fit for me. So they self-elect out of that activity. Same thing is going to apply to your syllabi, which would include those student learning outcomes. So again, the more clear we can be about what is the point, what are we hoping for here, we can target those things with modification. Or to say, this really isn't a good fit for this person based on what we know about the disability and the intersection, right? But you don't need to make that decision. That's why we're here. It's awesome. This is my favorite part of this job. I'm going to say one more thing. Sometimes it can take time to find what's going to work. So maybe you don't have flexible deadlines for certain assignments in your class, but because we took 3 days to find what will work before the student could do it, that would be an appropriate time for an extension to be implemented. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Marissa. My name is Devin Tatro. I manage the Disability Services Office here on the Juneau campus, University of Alaska Southeast. We have campuses in Ketchikan, Sitka, and serve surrounding communities in Southeast Alaska. I'm going to talk through or read this scenario. I'm going to pause. I'm going to run through a common question we get from faculty. Then I'll glance at the chat and give a chance for those to unmute who want to make comments or questions about scenario 6. In this case, you've received a faculty notification letter for Jack, notifying you of extended time on exams and flexibility with deadlines. Jack, the student, requests to take the first exam 2 days later than the rest of the class and test at the disability office. Jack has not turned in the homework leading up to this exam, and he has not contacted you about turning it in late. Let me jump into the initial question we get from faculty, and I'll then glance at the chat and look for questions and comments. So faculty often will ask, and you might be thinking this too, do I have to let Jack take the exam late? The short answer, if Jack asks you prior to the exam date, which follows university protocol of notifying disability services in advance, right? And you in advance together that you need this accommodation, that you need to extend your due date for your exam, that short answer is yes, right? So there's a couple instances that I will address, a couple scenarios similar to those I've worked with recently that address that yes, right? So a math professor who says it's problematic to extend the test because releasing scores might be vital to the pacing of her course, right? So students are affected if she can't release the scores of the course the next day. In this case, it's still a yes, and the professor was encouraged to write an alternate exam. Let's talk about another alternative that might be presented. So a test in which what we call the learning outcomes are fundamentally altered, that have to be an interactive process with DS. So for instance, a business course that is simulating an accounting firm in which meeting deadlines for clients is outlined in the syllabus as a fundamental part of the course, a learning objective of this class. So in that case, it might be, because it alters the learning objectives, it could be still a yes, in which case the professor would potentially create an alternate assignment, for example. So I dealt with a situation like that recently, and the fortunate thing is that this professor had already notified disability services upon receiving the notification letter. So we were able to kind of think and brainstorm ahead if this were to happen, right? Which is a great reminder to contact disability services if you have apprehensions right away, with especially a deadline flexibility accommodation. So again, short answer, yes, if the student is following the protocol for requesting an extension, you do have to, but unless the student learning objective is being compromised, let the student take the test, right? And work with us in that interactive process to figure out how, right? Whether it's making an alternate test, whether it's waiting to release exam scores until the student completes their test, or providing an alternate way for that student to display their learning. I will pause here to glance at the chat or invite you to unmute if you have questions or comments about either this scenario or what I outlined. So in the chat, we have, what is considered a reasonable notification time for the student to contact the instructor? I have had students contact me at the end of an exam window, which to me is not reasonable. That's a great question. So when is it reasonable to request an extension? So I'm going to give my initial answer, and then I'm going to let my colleagues give their input too. I'm a newer disability professional, and I'm sure my colleagues have seen something like this before. That's a unique situation to me, that a student is notifying you right like when the exam is going on. I can see why that'd be tricky. So if the student is notifying you before the exam deadline or before the assignment deadline, they are giving notice that they're having a disability-related flare-up that they obviously did not anticipate, and they need extra time, and they're following their accommodation. Let me open it up to Anne, Amber, Karen, and Marissa to give some extra input especially considering that this is a tricky situation.
It can be tricky, and since we tend to allow students to ask for that extension of an exam window based on some sort of episodic disability, we would want to find out from the student what happened that they needed the extension right at the end of the exam window. Did they have some sort of flare up right before the exam was due? That's the first place I went.
And what we often refer to is an extenuating circumstance, right? So an alternative to this scenario, to the student requesting the accommodation in time, would be potentially the student not telling you before the test and notifying you after the fact, after the deadline, that they couldn't meet that deadline, right? So would investigate, like Anne said, whether this was an extenuating circumstance. For example, the student was hospitalized and had no way to notify you that they weren't going to meet that deadline. Again, that'd be what we call an interactive process, brainstorming solutions, whether it's an alternate assignment, an alternate test, or finding a different way for the student to display their learning, or holding on to those test scores if possible until this student can take the exam. I'm going to keep glancing at the chat and invite you to unmute as well if you have more questions or comments.
Sorry, this is one that I get a lot. I teach a lot of online courses. And so the other side of this is I've had students who have asked for every single exam to be taken late, which is a problem for a math class where I have to post solutions. And like you said, I can obviously write an alternative exam, except when there's 5 exams in the class, that's a lot of extra work on me. And that's not necessarily something I can do in one day when I'm teaching 4 other classes. So how do I respond to that student when every single exam they need an extension, which is going to put the other students behind?
I'll say my initial thoughts and then I'll open it up to my colleagues. This would first require a conversation with the student. And what's great, again, about notifying disability services very early on is that we can have a preemptive conversation with the student to determine, first of all, is flexibility a good fit for this course, right? Based off of maybe the severity of your symptoms or the frequency of your symptoms right now, and given the amount of exams in this class and the narrow window, for instance, of exams, should we anticipate finding another option for you, looking ahead at the syllabus and the number of deadlines? That's my initial thought. I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues, thinking about in particular if this is habitual and how can we help relieve through this interactive process some of the burden on you to be creating alternative exams.
I have some thoughts to add. I think I'm curious about how long the exam windows might be in a certain class. If it's open for several days, it may not be appropriate to be extending past that. So I think that's a factor as well, as far as, how much opportunity was there to take the exam in the designated time. And then also, for how long could you potentially hold those exam answers for the rest of the class? If the student's able to take it within 24 hours and it isn't withholding information that other students need to such a degree that it's a problem, it may be frequent and annoying, but not actually truly affect others in a way that makes that not work for them. So again, I think while this happens and it can be unfortunate or difficult to deal with, it may be totally valid that a student does have a flare-up because their symptoms are exacerbated by stress. And so they truly are having an epileptic episode each time they're doing an exam for their math class. So it may not be sincere, it may not be a good fit, or it may be something that we truly need to try and find a solution for.
Thanks, Marissa. And I see another question raised too.
I don't know if I raised my hand. I didn't know if you called on me.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to just follow up with Latrice's question. It is also, if you get a lot of students asking for makeup exams, that means me proctoring potentially up to 10 hours in 1 week. If I have all these students that have different time commitments, is it okay to send these students to disability services and take the exam there? Or do they need to actually have an accommodation?
Do you mean rather the student needs to have an accommodation for alternative testing
Yes,
as
right.
requested?
Because I would assume that I can't just send the students who say I'm sick today, right? Those would be the ones I have to take care of. But if they have accommodations for alternative testing scenarios that they usually don't take advantage of, right? I have usually a huge proportion of students with testing accommodations that still choose to take the exams in my classroom just because I assume it's easier for them. But if they miss an exam, can I then send them to disability services? I see Marissa nod, so thanks.
Definitely.
In Anchorage too.
Yeah. If a student has accommodations, they miss the exam, even though they prefer to take it with you, it's fine to send them to us at that point. Unfortunately, we won't be able to proctor for students who don't have accommodations, even if it's a good reason. Yeah, I think
Thank you. Great.
But on the UAF campus, we do have the testing center at the Student Success Center. So there is testing available, proctored testing available on campus. So even for your sick students, that don't have accommodations, if you'd like them to test somewhere other than with you directly, there is an option. So over in the library on the 6th floor, they can test with the Student Success Center. That might be an option.
Thank you.
Anchorage has a testing center in the library as well, and DSS does some courtesy proctoring for students who are not registered with us, but it's few and far between. But it's always worth an ask.
I'll address one more question that's come up in similar situations. And that's in particular because our flexibility with deadlines accommodations, in my experience, can be the most challenging accommodation for faculty to navigate, along with our office and with students. So one question a faculty might have, especially considering that Jack hasn't turned in his homework assignments, is at what point are they feeling that this accommodation's not in the student's best interest, right? Because they're already not managing their time and they're experiencing intrinsic barriers to passing it in, or rather, like I believe it was Marissa who pointed out, stress exacerbates disabilities and they could truly be having a disability related episode or flare up when deadlines arise or when exams approach. What we do try to remind, and this was touched upon in scenario 2, is that students with or without accommodations can fall behind in courses, right? So disability services students still experience the same consequences as other students who aren't keeping up with their work or aren't turning work on time. When we discuss flexibility with deadlines with students, we do talk about the management of time, right? And how this accommodation removes barriers, but also comes with responsibility to navigate communication with faculty, with the DS office, with managing time and deadlines and making up work. So we do work with students to navigate this accommodation, but also focusing on the fact that we're removing barriers. We can't ensure success as a disability services office. And you as a faculty member can't do that either, though you do care about your students and want to see them succeed. Thank you. I just looked at the chat one more time, and I don't see any more questions and comments. I believe we are hanging out a little bit after this and giving some extra time for questions along with coffee chat tomorrow. So if anything arises, we'll be here to answer those questions. But for now, I'll turn it over for scenario number 7.
Before you move on, I just want to add that the flexibility accommodation could also apply to students requesting incompletes. It could apply to student needing additional time and filling out registration documents, requests for withdrawals, the add drop. It's a very complicated accommodation, and it can apply to many things that the student's doing on campus.
I appreciate that. And just, yeah, noting that importance that because of this accommodation can encompass so many different things, notifying DS as soon as you get that gut feeling or reaction or saying, oh, this is a lot of extra work for me, or how can we, this might not be good for the student, being able to plan ahead and talk with you and the student to navigate what might come up in the length of the course.
Okay, this is Karen again for scenario 7, but I don't see it on my screen, so I might have clicked something and now I see is everybody. So hopefully scenario 7 is on the screen for everyone else. I'll just read my courtesy copy of it. So we're now addressing Jane. So you've received, I'm talking to faculty, you've received your faculty notification letter for student Jane, who does get extra time on exams and also preferred seating in the classroom. On the first day of class, Jane has a lot of questions about the syllabus, and you've answered them. I mean, that's what orientation day, that first day, you're going over the syllabus, getting everybody acclimated to the class and what the expectations are. However, 2 days later, Jane starts emailing you and has some of these same questions that were addressed and answered in the classroom, and also might even be written out on the syllabus itself. And it just sort of appears that Jane's is really having a struggle with understanding, you know, the instructions or the expectations for the course. And now class session has happened again, and Jane is starting to begin to monopolize class time with her questions. So, oh my goodness, you're the instructor of record, you're trying to manage your classroom. What is going on? That was a week ago, we covered that. Why is this still coming up? And so, at the same time, still, you know, this is your passion. You've gone into teaching as your career. How can I help this student? What's not getting through? Or the student is now interrupting other people by being so, let's just say, enthusiastic in the class to continue to ask questions when we've moved past that. Or it's a question that you are believing should have been addressed with the pre-reading before coming into the class lecture, because class lecture pace is pretty fast, and the expectation for all the students that was explained in the syllabus is, you know, read this, we'll discuss this in class. And now the student's asking some pretty elementary questions of what was the reading or things like that. So you are trying to still respect the student in the classroom, but you're seeing how other people are, you know, giving verbal indications that they're getting frustrated as well. And you just want to make sure that you're respecting all the students, but it's impacting the other students. What are your choices? Can you discipline this student? What's going on? You're now getting overwhelmed. And you know, how can you set a limit with what's going on? Because by third class session, it's already becoming a problem. So some of the methods for handling this are explained on the companion document that you might still have in front of you, which is just trying to make sure you've set explicit you know, standards for classroom behavior or concerns, because it starts to approach perhaps a code of conduct issue, because the you know, the student is providing some disruptive conduct in the classroom. And so making sure as the manager of your classroom to try to put a stop to that, you know, asking to send any questions, you know, after class, or, oh, you know, Jane, we covered that earlier in this lecture. I need to move on now. And if you could email that to me after class, I'd be more than happy to address that with you, at least to help you with your ability to keep being able to cover what you plan to cover during the class session, going along without it dropping down to a standstill of not getting anywhere. Sometimes if the student is just becoming pretty, no, I just asked the question, I'm paying to be here. This is my time too. And something that you're thinking, oh goodness, this is not going in the direction I want it to go. It can always be, well, it doesn't sound like this is a good you know, time for this. And as long as respect is still in place, maybe asking the student to be able to leave for this class session, but of course being invited back for the next class session, because you're trying to continue with lecturing and covering the material that you had planned to cover during this this date. The still asking, being able to work with disability support services or finding out, or usually these are the type of questions we're getting pretty early on. We are getting the phone call by the third class session. That's something the students sure ask a whole lot of questions that I would think they would have mastered by now at this point in their, if it's a 300 level course or something like that. And seeking support, because if it is starting to impact you, there can always be a resource that it's a student of concern in the classroom, and you're trying to reach out to dean of students, because you are identifying this as somehow it's obstructing your ability to teach your class, or it's looking at the code of conduct that all students need to follow who are taking courses. And certainly through our campus, I'm pretty sure it's with our other MAUs, making sure students are always aware of the student code of conduct expectation outlined for all students taking courses. If one of them is disruptive or obstructive actions because they're interfering with classroom or your ability to teach your material, and it's interfering, it does possibly start to rise to a level of this is becoming a conduct issue. Sometimes the student, we've toggled on this a couple times, in the high school settings, they're allowed to raise hands, hey, what about this? And they think they're very, I used the word already, but very enthusiastically participating in class, when that is not how you are seeing the class dynamic. And the student, just through maybe just a social cue, is not recognizing how they are interfering with your ability to be teaching the course. And it would just be, again, trying to interrupt the behavior right in the moment of, oh, you know what, I think I already answered that before. My office hours and my syllabus are, 3 to 4 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Let's discuss that then, in order to still, be able to do what you need to do. Starting to set limits of all of a sudden, on the other hand, the student is now emailing you constantly, and they're needing constant instruction for what should be the assignment that you've set, or the assignment that's in Blackboard or Canvas, and the rubric of how you're going to grade it is all spelled out. Student needs to do X, Y, and Z, and you will grade on A, B, C. And yet the student is still asking, questions that are getting a little bit beyond what you are thinking they should be handling at this point in the college course. So still being able to express, this is not the right time for that now. Let's meet during my office hours, which I've given to you. If you are contacting disability support services or privately, not outing the student in the middle of a class session, but I know you work with disability support, why don't you go talk to them? I know a faculty would never do that, but the frustration level certainly can be elevated, that the instructor is getting exasperated with the behaviors. But it can be, or they're encouraging the student to come back to us, and we are more candid with sort of asking some questions and finding out, oh, well, you're right, in high school there was a lot of opportunity just to make sure you're doing exactly what you need to do, but this is a different environment now that you're in college, and some of these actions that you're doing in the classroom are not fair to your peers. Letting the student be aware of what it is. Student may not care, but making sure they are notified that this is interrupting what you're trying to do. And then if it does have to go up to a code of conduct issue, that will be respectfully handled through the Dean of Students office. The student may even have a DSS advocate with them. Going before a code of conduct situation can always be very stressful for anybody, and just trying to make sure it's policy, it's what we're trying to do to figure out what is going on, because you are held to a standard. Again, I'm just looking at my sheet of disruptive actions. And it is hard if the student doesn't mean to. It's still happening, but the student is just very over engaged with how they want to participate in class. And if DSS is happily involved with what it is, it's having some of these conversations privately with the student to say, well, show me what's on, what are you working on now to do that? And, oh, I see that the syllabus is pretty clear with what you need to do. Can you spend some time on that part? And if you have questions, why don't you write them down? And that way it can be respectfully administered to the instructor to be answering. So I've sort of front loaded a lot of that stuff as I'm trying to talk through it. Things to consider, because we can't say it enough, all students are responsible for adhering to the code of conduct, including the disruptive behavior that is now starting to overtake one of your classes. And students with accommodations may require different communication methods than typically used. So trying to figure out, it's not high school. Sometimes, no more than 4 questions per day in my class can not go down right. And if the student is just very excited to be in class, they're so proud to be in college, but they are just monopolizing every aspect of your time, can be very unfortunate for you, because you're still trying to teach the class for everyone. It is just a matter of trying to have the student work with DSS, so we can also think of some strategies to help the student not be as impulsive, not to be as insistent on you teaching sort of a one-on-one class versus you trying to address 35 or 70 students in your class. Michael Votava is on, just in case I've not addressed something from a code of conduct aspect that he may need to chime in to assist, or any questions from anyone listening to this part of the presentation. Again, I just see a bunch of icons for faces. So if anyone has a hand up, I might not be seeing it. So I'm going to rely on my colleagues to tell me if I'm on the wrong screen and someone has a question. Oh, I had an example I was thinking about this weekend. There has been a customized note that I wrote for a student at one time, because they were so eagerly enthusiastic for the class and behaving very old reference of, Arnold Horshack on Welcome Back, Kotter. I got a question. But to where it's just really taking over what you're doing. A customized note that was sort of related to them was, this student has asked for DSS to include a customized note related to their disabilities, and they may appear to be overly assertive in their behavior, and they're an enthusiastic learner, sometimes getting over engaged in the dynamics of the classroom. And they've asked for you to be forthright with them, to let them know directly. And students been made aware that experiencing disabilities does not excuse behavior that violates the code of conduct. So that was actually a true customized note that was once included, but that was after lots of conversation with the student who wanted to have something like that, because they were also trying to respect the boundaries of what's going on in the classroom. But they knew by their disability that in the moment, they're just going to be supercharged and super there and interrupting, and they're working on that on other aspects of just things that, we all have goals that we work on. And so I'm just sharing with you that it's not a customized note that gets written every semester for every single student, but this is one that has been written in the past at the UAA campus.
I know we've only got a couple minutes left. I don't know if you want me to launch into this very complicated scenario in 2 minutes. Do a Reader's Digest version. I do promise that I will update the companion document with some answers that we may not get to. So this is a situation where DS would reach out to a faculty member to let them know that the student is going to be in their class or in their lab. In this scenario, we wrote it as a lab, because then we could address some other issues. The student has a personal care attendant. They have a service animal. They have 2 interpreters because they are deaf. And then there's a DS aide assigned to help them manipulate lab material. So it's quite a bit. A lot of the questions that come up are whether or not the animal, a dog, would have to have personal protective equipment, similarly to the other participants. We get questions about whether or not the student is qualified to be in the lab. Questions about the interpreters, the DS aide, or the PCA needing to participate in the lab safety training. Whether or not the lab has room for people. So there's room, we don't have enough chairs, and there's room, we're breaking fire code. And those are two different questions that we would have to address. The grading being based on manipulating material, similarly to grades being written based on people being able to write. If the aide is manipulating the material at the student's direction, it's the same as somebody else writing for that person. A lab partner performing the task for students. We actually have had the question, it's going to take a lot of time. Are you going to pay me more? That, you know, we'll certainly talk to your boss, but this is something that we all have to do. And whether or not the student can be successful. And again, it's going to be figuring out how to give the student access to the course so that they can then be successful in the class. So possible solutions, and I am out of time, is to be open and to contact DSS. And that's going to be my Reader's Digest answer so that people can ask questions or hop off. And somebody put in the chat, in this scenario, if the student only needed the service animal, they might not be working with DS. The service animal can go wherever the person can go without accommodations. And that is true. There are places that service animals cannot go depending on the level of biohazard for a lab. And so that is something we would want to talk to the faculty about what is going on with the lab. In the, I don't know, 10 years I've been doing this, we've only had one time a service dog was restricted from going someplace, and we sent a person with that student to fill in as the service dog. So we still have to make the accommodation if it's not the dog. So there's a lot of information about this scenario in the companion document, and I want to make sure that people have an opportunity to ask questions and not go too far over our scheduled time.
This is Abel. Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
So I teach mostly online classes, and although this hasn't happened to me in the 10 years or so that I've been doing this, it would be really hard for me to accommodate a blind student in a lab class where students have to evaluate and record behaviors of mice in videos. So is this a situation where the student would be asked to take another course, or how would you approach that?
So not necessarily. We actually have had something similar to that, and we had an aide describing what was happening visually in the class to the blind student. Now, how successful that was, I don't know, but that was our approach because the student needed the class for their degree.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
We appreciate your time and attention today. We also are going to have what we call a coffee chat tomorrow morning that will be available for people to log in and join in so that you can follow up with any questions you might have had from today or to continue the discussion from today. And we'll post a link to that so you can register for that as well if you'd like. A survey will be sent out to all registered participants so that you can fill that out. We do encourage you to complete that survey so that we can improve and further develop our training for our campus communities.
We want to thank you all for joining us.
And we appreciate your time here, and please feel free to contact our offices directly.